Sometimes the cruelest moments in life lead to the greatest blessings. When 11-year-old Clara Evans was sold like livestock to pay her family's debts, she thought her world had ended. A mountain man named Silas McGraw bought her that day, in 1847, but not for the reasons the other men wanted her. He took Clara to his cabin in the Colorado mountains and raised her as his own daughter. He taught her to hunt, survive, and stand strong in a world that showed little mercy to women. For 10 years, she grew up safe under his protection, learning the ways of the wilderness. Now Clara is 21, and the dangerous men who remember her as a helpless child have come looking for her. They expect to find that same frightened little girl from the auction block. They're about to discover how wrong they are. But what secret about Clara's past has Silas been hiding all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Missouri auction block still bore the stains of countless tears. But on that September morning in 1847, Clara Evans stood upon it with a dignity that surprised even the auctioneer. Her small hands trembled slightly as she clutched the torn hem of her only dress, but her chin remained raised despite the jeers and crude comments from the crowd below. Silas McGraw watched from the back of the gathering, his weathered face hidden beneath the wide brim of his hat. At 42, he had seen enough of the world's cruelties to recognize them when they stood before him in the form of a child being sold to the highest bidder. The mountain man's calloused hands rested on his rifle, not in threat, but in the unconscious gesture of a man who had learned to protect what mattered. "What am I bid for this fine specimen?" the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of a man who had sold everything from livestock to human souls. "Strong back, young enough to train proper, and look at those hands. She'll work hard for whoever takes her home." Clara's eyes swept across the faces below her, seeing only hunger and calculation. There was the tobacco farmer, who'd already bid on 2 other children that morning, his yellow teeth visible in a predatory grin. The saloon owner from 3 towns over stood with his arms crossed, evaluating her like a piece of furniture he might purchase. And there, near the front, the man who made her stomach turn with fear, a thin, pale figure whose eyes held no warmth, only cold assessment. $50, called the tobacco farmer, spitting a stream of brown juice into the dirt. 60, countered the saloon owner. The pale man raised his hand. 75. Clara closed her eyes, trying to remember her mother's voice singing lullabies on peaceful evenings when their small farm still belonged to them. Before the drought killed their crops, before her father took ill with fever, before the debt collectors came with papers that might as well have been death sentences. $100. The voice came from the back, deep and steady. Clara opened her eyes to see the crowd turning, murmuring among themselves. The man who had spoken stepped forward, and Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in months, an absence of fear. There was something in his weathered face, in the way he carried himself, that spoke of strength tempered by kindness. $100, Silas repeated, his grey eyes meeting Clara's for just a moment. In that brief connection, he saw not a commodity to be purchased, but a child who needed protection. He had fought in the war, had seen enough suffering to last several lifetimes, and when he looked at Clara Evans, he saw his own sister Mary, who had died of consumption when she was barely older than this girl now standing on the block. "Going once," the auctioneer called, clearly hoping for higher bids. The pale man's lips curved into what might have been a smile. 125. Silas stepped closer, his boots loud against the packed earth. $200. "Cash!" A hush fell over the crowd. $200 was more than most men made in half a year. The auctioneer's eyes widened, and even the pale man looked surprised. 200 going once, going twice, sold to the mountain man. Clara felt her knees nearly give way with relief. She didn't know who this man was, or what he intended, but something in her young heart told her that whatever lay ahead couldn't be worse than what she had just escaped. Silas approached the platform as the crowd began to disperse. Their entertainment concluded. He counted out the bills with deliberate precision, his movements economical and purposeful. When the transaction was complete, he looked up at Clara, still standing on the block. "Come on down from there, child," he said softly, extending his hand. "My name is Silas McGraw, and I'm going to take you somewhere safe." Clara hesitated for only a moment before placing her small hand in his large, calloused one. His grip was gentle but secure, and when he helped her down from the platform, she felt as though she was stepping not just onto solid ground, but into a new life entirely. "What's your name?" Silas asked as they walked toward his wagon, loaded with supplies for the journey back to his mountain home. "Clara Evans," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Well, Clara Evans, I want you to know something important. You're not my property, despite what those papers might say. You're under my protection now, and that means you're safe. Do you understand?" Clara nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure she did understand. In her short life, she had learned that adults often said one thing while meaning another, but there was something in Silas McGraw's voice that made her want to believe him. The wagon ride to Colorado Territory took 3 weeks, and with each mile they traveled away from Missouri, Clara felt a little more of the weight lift from her shoulders. Silas proved to be a man of few words but many kindnesses. He made sure she ate first at every meal, wrapped her in his own blanket when the nights grew cold, and never once spoke to her with anything but gentle respect. On the 10th day of their journey, as they camped beside a clear mountain stream, Clara finally found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her chest since the auction. "Mr. McGraw, why did you buy me?" Silas was whittling a piece of pine, carving what would become a small bird. He didn't look up immediately, but Clara could see him considering his words carefully. "I had a sister once," he said finally. "Her name was Mary, and she was about your age when she passed. I couldn't save her from the consumption, but I figured maybe I could save someone else from something worse." He paused in his carving, his gray eyes meeting hers across the firelight. "Every child deserves a chance to grow up safe and loved. Clara, that's all I aim to give you." Tears came then, the first real tears Clara had allowed herself since her parents died. They weren't tears of sorrow, but of a relief so profound it felt like she might float away. Silas didn't try to stop her crying or tell her to hush. He simply continued his whittling until her sobs subsided, then handed her the finished bird. "For you," he said simply, "to remember that you're free now." The McGraw homestead sat in a valley surrounded by pine-covered peaks, a testament to both Silas's skill as a builder and his eye for defensible positions. The cabin was larger than Clara had expected, with 2 bedrooms, a main living area dominated by a stone fireplace, and a kitchen that smelled of cedar and wood smoke. Behind the house, a clear creek provided fresh water, and beyond that, corrals held several horses and a few head of cattle. "This is your room," Silas said, showing Clara to the smaller bedroom. It contained a bed with a real mattress, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. "I built it hoping someday I might have a daughter to put in it." Clara ran her fingers over the smooth wood of the bed frame, noting the careful joinery and the small carved flowers along the headboard. "You built this for me?" "Built it for Hope," Silas replied. "And now Hope has a name." The first winter was hard, not because of Silas's care, which was constant and thoughtful, but because Clara had to learn to trust that this new life was real. She started at every unexpected sound, flinched when Silas moved too quickly, and often woke in the night expecting to find herself back on the auction block. But Silas was patient with her fears. He taught her to read using an old Bible and a collection of books he had accumulated over the years. He showed her how to tend the animals, how to preserve food for winter, and how to read the signs in nature that told of coming weather. Most importantly, he taught her that she had value, beyond what any man might pay for her. "You've got a sharp mind, Clara," he told her one evening as she worked through a particularly difficult passage in one of his books. "Don't ever let anyone tell you that being female means being weak. Some of the strongest people I've ever known were women." By spring, Clara had begun to laugh again. Not the careful, measured responses she had learned were safe, but real laughter that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her. She delighted in the wildflowers that covered the mountain meadows, in the antics of the new calves, and in Silas's dry sense of humor that often caught her by surprise. "You know," she said one morning as they worked together in the vegetable garden behind the cabin, "I can't remember the last time I felt this happy." Silas paused in his hoeing to look at her, noting the way the mountain sun had brought color back to her cheeks, and how her eyes now held light instead of fear. "Happiness is something you have to fight for in this world," he said, "but it's worth the fight, and you're worth fighting for." As Clara's second year in the mountains began, she started to understand that Silas McGraw had given her something far more valuable than safety or shelter. He had given her back her childhood, and more importantly, he had given her a future filled with possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. 5 years had passed since that first difficult winter, and Clara had grown into a confident 16-year-old. With calloused hands and keen eyes that missed nothing in the wilderness around their mountain home. She could track a deer through dense forest, read weather patterns in cloud formations, and handle a rifle with accuracy that impressed even Silas. But on this particular autumn morning, as she sorted through a wooden crate that had arrived with the last supply wagon, she discovered something that would change everything. The crate had belonged to her parents, one of the few possessions that hadn't been sold to pay their debts. Silas had quietly arranged to have it sent to them, though he hadn't told Clara of its existence until now. Inside, wrapped in faded silk that still held the faint scent of her mother's lavender sachets, lay a silver locket Clara had never seen before. "Mama never wore jewelry," Clara murmured, turning the delicate piece over in her palm. The locket was heavier than it appeared, with intricate engravings around its edge that spoke of quality craftsmanship. When she pressed the tiny clasp, it opened to reveal not just the expected miniature portraits, but something far more significant. On one side was indeed a painting of her parents, younger than she remembered them, dressed in fine clothing that seemed impossible given their humble farm life. But it was the other side that made her breath catch. There, carefully folded and fitted into the small space, was a piece of paper bearing an official seal and cramped handwriting. Silas looked up from sharpening his hunting knife as Clara approached him with the locket, her face pale with confusion. "Silas, I found something strange in Mama's things. This locket, I've never seen it before, and there's a paper inside that doesn't make sense." She handed him the locket, and Silas studied the document with the careful attention he gave to tracking signs. His weathered face grew increasingly grave as he read, and Clara saw something in his expression she had rarely witnessed: genuine alarm. "Clara, sit down," he said quietly, gesturing to the chair beside the fireplace. "We need to talk about your family, and I'm afraid it's not going to be easy to hear." Clara settled into the chair, her heart beginning to race. "What does the paper say?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeking guidance in the dancing flames. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had been carrying secrets too heavy for one person to bear alone. "According to this document, your parents weren't just farmers who fell on hard times. Your father was Edmund Evans, heir to the Evans shipping fortune out of Boston. Your mother was Charlotte Whitmore before she married him. The Whitmores owned textile mills throughout New England." Clara stared at him in disbelief. "That's impossible. We were poor. We lost everything when your father's business partners cheated him out of his inheritance and framed him for embezzlement." Silas continued gently. "This paper is a copy of your father's will, Clara. He left everything to you. What remained of the shipping company, properties in 3 states, and investments that were hidden from the men who betrayed him. By rights, you're one of the wealthiest. Young women in America. The words seemed to echo in the cabin as Clara struggled to process what she was hearing. Wealthy? Her family had died in poverty, forced to sell their small farm to pay debts that had crushed them. How could any of this be true? But if this is real, she said slowly, why didn't anyone come looking for me when my parents died? Why was I sold? At auction like a common orphan. Silas's jaw tightened, and Clara saw his hand unconsciously move toward his rifle. Because the men who destroyed your father made sure no one knew you existed. They burned records, paid off officials, and did everything they could to erase the Evans family line. If you had been found and identified, their theft would have been exposed. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the cabin walls. So, when I was sold, it wasn't just bad luck or unfortunate circumstances, Silas confirmed grimly. Someone made sure you ended up on that auction block, probably hoping you'd disappear forever into a life where no one would ever think to look for Edmund Evans's daughter. The implications of this revelation washed over Clara like cold mountain water. Everything she had believed about her family's fate had been a lie. Her parents hadn't simply failed as farmers, they had been deliberately destroyed by people who wanted to steal their fortune. Who were they? Clara asked, surprised. By the steadiness of her own voice. The men who did this to my family? Silas rose from his chair and walked to the window, gazing out at the mountain peaks as if they might provide answers. The document mentions 3 names: Marcus Holbrook, Jonathan Reed, and Samuel Whitfield. They were your father's business partners, and according to this, they're now running the shipping company that should rightfully be yours. Clara joined him at the window, her mind racing with questions and a growing anger she had never felt before. For 5 years, she had mourned her parents as victims of cruel fortune. Now she was learning they had been murdered, not with guns or knives, but with lies and legal documents and calculated betrayal. There's something else, Silas said quietly. I've been hearing things in town lately. Men asking questions about a girl who would be about your age now, someone who might have connection to the Evans family. I thought it was just curiosity, but now you think they're looking for me, Clara finished. I think they've discovered that Edmund Evans had a daughter, and they're trying to find you before you can learn the truth about your inheritance. Silas turned to face her, his grey eyes serious. Clara, if I'm right about this, then you're in more danger now than you were on that auction block 5 years ago. These aren't just cruel men looking to exploit a child. They're murderers protecting a fortune built on your family's blood. Clara looked down at the silver locket in her hands, this small piece of metal and paper that had transformed her from a rescued orphan into a threat to powerful men. The weight of it seemed enormous now, not just physically but symbolically. It represented not just her true identity, but a target painted on her back by people who had already destroyed her family. Once, what do we do? She asked. Silas was quiet for a moment, and Clara could see him thinking through possibilities with the strategic mind that had kept them both safe for 5 years. First, we prepare for the possibility that they'll find us, he said finally. I'm going to teach you things I'd hoped you'd never need to know. How to fight with more than just hunting skills. How to disappear if you need to. How to protect yourself against men who won't hesitate to kill you. Clara nodded, feeling a strange calm settle over her. The frightened child who had stood on that auction block was gone, replaced by a young woman who had learned strength in these mountains. If her family's killers wanted to finish what they had started, they would discover that Clara Evans was no longer helpless. And second, she prompted. Silas smiled grimly. Second, we make sure you live long enough to claim what's rightfully yours. Your parents died believing they had failed you, Clara. But they didn't fail. They left you the tools to get justice, even if they didn't know it at the time. Clara closed the locket with a soft click, slipping it into her pocket where it rested. Against her heart. Tomorrow, Her life would become more complicated and dangerous than she had ever imagined. But tonight, in the safety of the cabin Silas had built for hope, she would prepare to become the woman her parents had never lived, to see someone strong enough to fight for what was right and smart enough to win. The Winchester rifle felt different in Clara's hands, now that she understood what she might need to use it for. What had once been lessons in hunting for food had transformed into something far more serious, preparation for a war she hadn't chosen but couldn't avoid. "Center mass," Silas instructed, as Clara took aim at the target he had set up 50 yards from the cabin. "In a real fight, you won't have time for fancy shooting. You aim for the biggest part of a man, and you shoot to stop him permanently." Clara squeezed the trigger, and the satisfying crack of the rifle echoed off the mountain walls. Her shot had found its mark dead center, just as the previous dozen had. What surprised her wasn't her accuracy. Silas had been teaching her to shoot for years, but how steady her hands remained, despite knowing that someday soon her target might not be made of wood and painted canvas. "Good," Silas nodded approvingly. "But shooting targets is different from shooting men who are shooting back. Tomorrow we'll start working on moving targets, shooting from cover, and reloading under pressure." As they walked back toward the cabin, Clara noticed movement on the ridge above their valley, a lone rider silhouetted against the late afternoon sky. Silas saw it too, his hand automatically moving to his sidearm. "Get inside and stay away from the windows," he said quietly. "Take your rifle with you." Clara obeyed without question, slipping through the cabin door while Silas positioned himself on the porch, appearing casual but ready for trouble. She watched through a crack in the shutters as the rider descended into their valley, and her breath caught when she recognized him. Jake Morrison was perhaps 20 years old, with sandy brown hair and the kind of easy smile that had made Clara's heart skip on the few occasions she had met him in town. He worked as a trapper and occasional guide for travelers heading deeper into the territory, and Clara had always thought him the handsomest young man she had ever seen. "Easy there, Mr. McGraw," Jake called out as he approached, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "Just Jake Morrison, coming to see if you folks might spare a cup of coffee and some conversation." Silas relaxed slightly, but didn't lower his guard entirely. "Jake, been a while since you came this far up the valley. What brings you by?" Jake dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, his movements easy and confident. "Truth is, I've been hearing some talk in town that's got me concerned. Mind if I come in and discuss it properly?" Clara felt her pulse quicken, though, whether from anticipation of seeing Jake or fear of what news he might bring, she couldn't say. Silas gestured for the young man to come inside, and Clara quickly moved away from the window, trying to appear as though she had been occupied with some domestic task. "Clara," Jake said warmly as he entered the cabin, removing his hat with the polite manners his mother had drilled into him. "You're looking well. Mountain life agrees with you." "Thank you, Jake," Clara replied, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Can I offer you some coffee?" As Clara busied herself with the coffee pot, she listened to Jake and Silas exchange pleasantries about weather and hunting conditions, but she could sense an undercurrent of tension, a carefulness in their words that suggested more serious matters waited to be discussed. Finally, with coffee served and the three of them settled around the cabin's main table, Jake's expression grew grave. "I'll get straight to it," he said, looking between Silas and Clara. "There's been men in town asking questions, well-dressed fellows from back east who don't look like they belong in this territory. They're claiming to be looking for a girl who would be about Clara's age now, someone with connections to a family called Evans." Clara's hand tightened around her coffee cup, but she kept her expression neutral. Silas leaned back in his chair, appearing relaxed while his eyes remained alert. "Lot of folks named Evans in the world," Silas said mildly. "What kind of men are these exactly?" Jake's jaw tightened. "The kind that make honest folks nervous just by being around. They've got money, that's clear enough, and they're not shy about spreading it around to get answers. But there's something Cold about them, Mr. McGraw. Something that doesn't sit right. What kind of questions are they asking? Clara found herself saying, surprised by her own boldness. Jake turned to her, his blue eyes serious. Specific ones. They know about the auction 5 years ago, and they know a mountain man bought a girl that day. They're offering a substantial reward for information about where that girl might be now. Clara felt the walls of the cabin seem to press closer around her. For 5 years, this mountain valley had been her sanctuary, a place where the cruelties of the outside world couldn't touch her. Now that safety was dissolving like morning mist in sunlight, how substantial a reward? Silas asked quietly. $500, Jake replied, and Clara heard the sharp intake of breath despite her efforts to remain calm. $500 was more money than most people in the territory would see in several years. It was enough to tempt even decent folks into betraying their neighbors. Did you tell them anything? Clara asked, the question carrying more weight than her careful tone suggested. Jake looked directly into her eyes, his expression earnest and honest. I told them I'd never heard of any such girl, and that mountain men tend to keep to themselves and don't socialize much in town. He paused, then added more quietly, but Clara, they're not going to give up easily, and $500 is going to make some folks very interested in remembering things they might have forgotten before. Silas stood and walked to the fireplace, ostensibly to add another log to the fire, but Clara knew he was thinking. She had watched him make this same movement countless times when working through problems that required careful consideration. "Jake," Silas said finally, turning back to face the younger man, "why are you telling us this? Most folks would mind their own business, especially when there's that kind of money involved." Jake was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving between Silas and Clara. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a sincerity that made Clara's heart flutter, despite the seriousness of their situation. "Because I've come to care about both of you," he said simply. "You've been kind to me when I've stopped by, and—" He looked directly at Clara, a slight flush creeping up his neck. "And because I'd hate to see anything happen to people I consider friends." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, but it was quickly tempered by the reality of their circumstances. If Jake was telling the truth about the men in town, then their peaceful life in the mountains was about to end. The question was whether it would end with them leaving voluntarily or being dragged away against their will. "There's something else," Jake continued reluctantly. "These men aren't working alone. They've got hired help. Rough-looking fellows who don't ask questions, if you take my meaning. And they're planning to search the mountain settlement systematically until they find what they're looking for." Silas returned to his chair, his decision apparently made. "Jake, I appreciate you bringing us this information. You've shown more loyalty and courage than we had any right to expect. What will you do?" Jake asked. Clara looked at Silas, seeing her own determination reflected in his grey eyes. They had always known this day might come, had prepared for it as best they could. Now the time for preparation was over. "We'll do what we have to do," Clara said quietly, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the silver locket beneath her shirt. "We'll be ready for them." The hand-carved chess set had been one of Silas's first gifts to Clara, crafted during long winter evenings when the mountain winds howled outside their cabin. Now, as they sat across from each other in the lamplight 3 days after Jake's warning, the familiar ritual of their evening game carried a different weight. Each move on the board reflected the strategic thinking they would need to survive what was coming. "Your bishop is exposed," Silas observed as Clara contemplated her next move. "In chess, as in life, you have to think 3 moves ahead of your opponent." Clara studied the board, seeing not just the immediate threat, but the pattern of attack Silas had been building for the past several moves. It was a lesson that extended far beyond the 64 squares between them. "But sometimes," she said, moving her knight to an unexpected position, "the best strategy is to do something your opponent doesn't expect." Silas smiled approvingly as he realized Clara's seemingly reckless move had actually set up a devastating counterattack. "Good. The men looking for you will expect you to run or hide." They won't expect you to be ready to fight back. Over the past 3 days, Clara's education had expanded far beyond marksmanship. Silas had taught her to move silently, through the forest, to set snares that could trip a horse or trap a man, and to use the mountain terrain to her advantage. More importantly, he had taught her to think like a strategist rather than a victim. "There's something I need to tell you about those men Jake warned us about," Clara said, as she captured one of Silas's pawns. "I think I know who sent them." Silas looked up from the board, his attention fully focused on her words. "Go on. I've been thinking about the names on that document in my mother's locket, Holbrook, Reed, and Whitfield. If they really did steal my father's fortune, then they've had 5 years to enjoy spending money that doesn't belong to them." Clara's voice grew harder as she continued. "Now, they discover that Edmund Evans had a daughter who could expose their crimes and reclaim her inheritance. They're not just looking for me, they're looking to eliminate a threat to everything they've built on my family's blood." "That's what I've been thinking too," Silas admitted, "which means they're not planning to capture you alive, Clara. Dead women can't testify about stolen fortunes or demand the return of their property." The weight of that realization settled between them, like a stone dropped into still water. Clara had grown up in these mountains under Silas's protection, but she wasn't naive about the world's cruelties. She understood that powerful men would kill to protect their secrets, especially when those secrets were worth millions of dollars. "Then we need to be smarter than they are," Clara said simply, moving her queen into position for what would be the winning attack. "And we need help." As if summoned by her words, they heard the sound of a horse approaching the cabin. Both Clara and Silas were on their feet instantly, weapons in hand, before they recognized Jake Morrison's voice, calling out a greeting. "It's me, Jake. I've got news, and it's not good." They let him in quickly, noting the tension in his face and the way. His hand stayed close to his gun, even after he was inside the cabin. "They're moving faster than I expected," Jake said without preamble. "The strangers left town this morning with their hired guns, and they're heading into the mountains. I heard them talking about searching every homestead in a 20-mile radius." Clara felt her stomach clench with fear, but her voice remained steady. "How long do we have? If they're moving systematically, maybe 3 days before they reach this valley." "But Clara," Jake hesitated, then plunged ahead. "I overheard something else. They're not just looking for you anymore. They know about Mr. McGraw, too. They know he's the one who bought you at auction, and they consider him an obstacle to be removed." Silas's jaw tightened, but Clara saw something in his eyes that surprised her. Not fear, but a cold anger that reminded her he had been a soldier long before he became her protector. "Let them come," Silas said quietly. "This mountain has hidden worse secrets than one girl and an old soldier." Jake looked between them, clearly wrestling with something. Finally, he took a deep breath and made his decision. "I want to help," he said firmly. "Whatever you're planning, I want to be part of it." Clara felt her heart skip, not just at his words, but at the courage behind them. Jake could have stayed in town, could have minded his own business and remained safe. Instead, he was volunteering to stand with them against men who killed without conscience. "Jake, you don't understand what you're offering," Clara said gently. "These aren't just rough men or claimed jumpers. They're killers protecting a fortune, and they'll murder anyone who gets in their way." "I understand perfectly," Jake replied, his blue eyes steady and determined. "And I also understand that I care too much about both of you to ride away and let them hurt you." Silas studied the young man for a long moment, weighing something in his mind. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, Jake, but if you're going to stand with us, you need to know exactly what we're up against." He gestured for Jake to sit down, then began to explain about Clara's true identity and the stolen inheritance that had put a target on her back. As the story unfolded, Jake's expression grew increasingly serious. When Silas finished, Jake was quiet for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what he had just learned. "So you're not just Clara the mountain girl," he said finally, looking at her with new understanding. "You're Clara Evans, rightful heir to a shipping fortune, and those men are coming to kill you for it." "That's right," Clara confirmed. "And now that you know, you're in danger too. They won't leave witnesses alive who could testify about what they've done." Jake stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the mountain peaks silhouetted against the star-filled sky. When he turned back to face them, his decision was written clearly on his face. "Then we'd better make sure we're the ones who survive to tell the story," he said simply. "What's the plan?" Clara looked at Silas, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his weathered features. They had spent 3 days preparing for a defensive fight, but now, with Jake's help, other possibilities opened before them. "The plan," Clara said slowly, the strategy crystallizing in her mind as she spoke, "is to use their arrogance against them. They're expecting to find a helpless girl and an old man hiding in the mountains. Instead, they're going to find a trap that will end their threats permanently." Silas smiled grimly at her words, recognizing the steel that had developed in his adopted daughter over the past 5 years. Clara Evans was no longer the frightened child from the auction block. She had become something far more dangerous. A young woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. "Check and mate," Clara said quietly, making the final move. On the chessboard that had been forgotten during their conversation, but she wasn't talking about the game anymore. Clara's leather journal lay open on the cabin table, filled with her careful observations about weather patterns, animal behavior, and the rhythm of mountain life. But the entries from the past week told a different story. One of preparation, strategy, and the transformation of a sanctuary into a fortress. "They'll come from the east," Clara wrote by lamplight, her pen moving steadily across the page. "The main trail leads that way, and men from the city won't know about the deer paths. On the North Ridge, we can use their ignorance against them." She paused in her writing to look across the table where Jake sat cleaning his rifle, his movements methodical and sure. 3 days of planning together had revealed qualities in him that went far beyond the charming smile that had first caught her attention. He was steady under pressure, quick to understand tactical situations, and completely committed to their cause despite the enormous danger it placed him in. "You're quiet tonight," Jake observed, looking up from his work. "Second. Thoughts?" Clara shook her head, closing the journal and setting aside her pen. "Not second thoughts, just thinking about how much my life has changed in the past week. 7 days ago I was Clara the mountain girl, worried about whether we'd have enough firewood for winter. Tonight I'm Clara Evans, planning to fight for my life against men who murdered my parents." Jake set down his rifle and reached across the table to cover her hand with his. The gesture was gentle but significant, and Clara felt warmth spread up her arm at the contact. "You're still the same person," he said quietly. "Learning the truth about your family doesn't change who you've become in these mountains. It just gives you more reason to fight for the life you've built here." Before Clara could respond, Silas entered the cabin carrying an armload of split wood. He paused in the doorway, taking in the scene of their joined hands, and Clara saw something flicker across his weathered features. Not disapproval, but the complex emotions of a father watching his daughter grow up. "Don't mind me," Silas said, with forced casualness, moving to stack the wood beside the fireplace. "Just getting ready for what promises to be a long night." Clara gently withdrew her hand from Jake's, suddenly aware of the tension that had entered the room. Over the past 5 years, Silas had been father, teacher, protector, and friend, all rolled into one. The idea of sharing her affections and her future with someone else must be difficult for him, even if that someone was as worthy as Jake Morrison. "Silas," Clara said carefully, "we need to talk about what happens after we deal with these men, about my future, and what I want to do with the inheritance if we succeed in claiming it." Silas finished stacking the wood and turned to face her, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight. "I've been thinking about that too. You're 21 now, Clara, old enough to make your own decisions about where you want to go and what you want to do with your life." The words hung in the air between Them, carrying implications that went far beyond the immediate crisis they faced. Clara realized that Silas was preparing to let her go, to release the daughter he had raised and protected so that she could become the woman she was meant to be. "I don't want to leave the mountains," Clara said firmly. "Whatever else happens, this is my home now. These peaks, this valley, this cabin, they're part of who I am. The inheritance may belong to me legally, but my heart belongs here." Relief flickered across Silas's face, quickly replaced by paternal pride. "I'm glad to hear that. But you should know that having that kind of wealth will bring responsibilities and opportunities you've never had to consider before." Jake cleared, his throat quietly drawing their attention. "If I may," he said hesitantly, "I have something I'd like to say about Clara's future." Both Clara and Silas turned to him expectantly. Jake stood up from the table, his usual easy confidence replaced by nervous determination. "Clara, these past few days have shown me something I probably should have realized long ago. You're the strongest, most capable woman I've ever met, and—" he paused, gathering his courage. "And I'm in love with you, have been for months. If I'm honest." Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. She had sensed Jake's growing feelings for her, had felt her own heart responding to his presence, but hearing the words spoken aloud made everything suddenly real and immediate. "Jake," she began, but he held up his hand. "Let me finish, please. I know this isn't the ideal time or place for such talk, what with killers coming for us and all. But if we're going to fight for our lives, I want you to know that I'm not just fighting to protect a friend. I'm fighting for the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with." Clara looked at Jake's earnest face, then at Silas, who was watching the exchange with the careful attention of a man trying to decide whether to approve or disapprove of a potential suitor for his daughter. "What exactly are you asking, Jake?" Clara said quietly. Jake took a deep breath and met her eyes directly. "I'm asking if you'll consider marrying me, Clara. Not right now, obviously, but after we've dealt with these men and you've had time to claim your inheritance and decide what you want to do with it. I'm asking if you'll let me be part of whatever future you choose to build." The proposal was simple, honest, and perfectly suited to the man who had offered it. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness or uncertainty. They were tears of gratitude for a future that suddenly seemed brighter and more hopeful than she had dared to imagine. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you, Jake Morrison. After we survive what's coming, after I reclaim what was stolen from my family, after all of this is over, yes." Jake's face broke into a grin that could have lit up the entire valley. He started to move around the table toward her, but Silas's voice stopped him. "Hold on there, young man," Silas said, but there was warmth in his tone rather than warning. "If you're going to marry my daughter, there are a few things we need to discuss first." Clara laughed, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep inside her chest. Here they were, surrounded by danger and preparing for a battle that could end all their lives, and Silas was still determined to play the protective father, making sure his daughter's suitor had honorable intentions. "Silas," she said gently, "I think those discussions can wait until after we make sure we all survive the next few days." "Fair enough," Silas agreed. Then extending his hand to Jake, he added, "But for now, welcome to the family, son, and I hope you're ready for what that means." Jake shook Silas's hand firmly, understanding that he was being accepted not just as Clara's chosen partner, but as someone worthy of the trust and loyalty that had sustained them in these mountains. "I'm ready," Jake said simply, "for whatever comes." Outside the cabin, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of snow from the higher peaks. Winter was coming early this year, and with it, the men who sought to destroy the family that had found each other in these wild mountains. But inside the warm cabin, surrounded by the people she loved most in the world, Clara felt ready to face whatever the dawn might bring. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin floor when Clara discovered the small wooden box hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Silas's room. She had been helping him retrieve extra ammunition when her foot caught on the uneven board, and when she knelt to examine it, the board lifted easily to reveal a carefully concealed compartment. "Silas," she called softly, her voice carrying a note of curiosity rather than alarm. "What's this?" Silas looked up from where he had been cleaning his pistol at the kitchen table, and Clara saw something flicker across his features. Not guilt exactly, but the expression of a man whose secrets were being unexpectedly revealed. He walked over to where Clara knelt beside the open hiding place, Jake close behind him. Without a word, Silas reached into the compartment and withdrew the wooden box, handling it with the reverence one might show a religious artifact. "I suppose it's time you knew," he said quietly, settling onto the edge of his bed with the box in his lap, "about who I was before I became the man who bought you at that auction." Clara and Jake sat on the floor beside the bed, their full attention focused on the weathered mountain man who had been the center of Clara's world for 5 years. Silas opened the box with careful fingers, revealing its contents: a military medal on a faded ribbon, a daguerreotype of a younger Silas in uniform, alongside other soldiers, and a letter bearing an official seal from the United States Army. "Congressional Medal of Honor," Silas said simply, lifting the medal so they could see it properly. "Awarded for actions during the Battle of Gettysburg, July 1863. Clara stared at the medal, then at the photograph showing Silas as a young soldier, with the same steady grey eyes, but a face unmarked by years of mountain weather and solitude. "You were a war hero," she said, her voice filled with wonder and new understanding. "I was a soldier who did what needed doing," Silas corrected gently. "But yes, I served with distinction. I was a sergeant in the Union Army, and later, after the war, I worked for a time as a scout and tracker for the military." Jake picked up the official letter, reading it carefully. "This says you led a company of men through enemy territory to rescue trapped civilians. It says you saved 47 people, including women and children." Silas nodded, his expression distant as he remembered events from decades past. There were Confederate forces surrounding a town in Pennsylvania. The locals couldn't evacuate because the roads were blocked. My men and I went in through the hills, just like we've been planning to do with our own situation here. Clara felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in her mind, the way Silas moved through the forest without making a sound, his uncanny ability to read terrain and predict where enemies might approach from, the methodical way he had taught her not just to shoot, but to think tactically about every situation. "That's why you're so good at all this," she said. "The planning, the strategy, the way you can look at this valley and see every advantage and vulnerability. You're not just a mountain man. You're a soldier." "Was a soldier," Silas corrected. But Clara shook her head. "No, you still are. You've been protecting me like a soldier protects his mission for 5 years. And now you're preparing to fight for me, the same way you fought for those civilians in Pennsylvania." Jake was still studying the photograph, noting the faces of the other soldiers who stood beside the younger Silas. "What happened to your unit after the war?" Silas's expression grew somber. "Most of them went home to farms and families. Some stayed in the army and went west to fight Indians. A few, like me, just wanted to find somewhere quiet and try to forget what we'd seen." "But you never really forgot," Clara said gently. "You just carried those skills with you to these mountains. And when you found me on that auction block, you saw another mission, another person who needed protecting." Silas looked at her with eyes that held both pride and sorrow. "You were so small standing up there, Clara, so frightened but trying to be brave. You reminded me of those children in Pennsylvania, the ones who tried not to cry even when the cannons were thundering all around them." Clara reached out and took his weathered hand in both of hers. "And you saved them, all of them, just like you saved me." "The difference," Silas said quietly, "is that this time I'm not fighting for strangers or following orders from officers I barely know. This time I'm fighting for my daughter." The word hung in the air between them, spoken aloud for the first time. Clara had known for years that Silas loved her as a father loves a child, but hearing him claim her so directly made her heart swell with emotion. "And you're not fighting alone this time," Jake added, his voice firm with determination. "You've got allies who know this country as well as you do, and who have just as much reason to want these bastards stopped." Silas smiled at the young man's fierce loyalty. "That's true, and it makes a difference, having people you trust watching your back." Clara studied the medal again, understanding now why Silas had hidden it away. For him, it represented not glory or honor, but memories of violence and loss that he had hoped to leave behind. Yet those same experiences had shaped him into the man capable of protecting and raising her. "There's something else you need to know about fighting men like the ones coming for us," Silas continued, his voice taking on the tone of a military instructor. "They'll be professionals, probably former soldiers themselves, or hired guns who've seen action. They won't panic easily, and they won't make the kind of mistakes that amateurs make. But they don't know this terrain," Clara pointed out. "They don't know where the game trails are, where the rocks are loose enough to start a slide, where the creek runs shallow enough to cross safely." "Exactly. And that's going to be our advantage. We know every stone and tree in this valley. We know where the wind carries sound and where it doesn't. We know which approaches are possible and which ones will get a man killed even if no one's shooting at him." Jake stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the mountains that had become as familiar to him as his own hands over the years of trapping and guiding in the territory. "How many men do you think they'll bring?" he asked. "Based on what?" "You overheard in town probably 6 to 8, Silas replied. "Enough to be sure of overwhelming any resistance, but not so many that they can't move quietly or control easily." Clara felt a chill of fear, quickly replaced by determination. 6 to 8 professional killers against the 3 of them seemed like impossible odds. But then she remembered the stories Silas had told her about military campaigns where small forces had defeated much larger ones through superior planning and knowledge of the battlefield. "We can do this," she said firmly. "We know this valley better than they ever could. We're fighting for our home, our family, our lives, and we have something they don't." "What's that?" Jake asked. Clara looked at the medal in Silas's hands, then at the 2 men who had become her world. "We have each other. They're just hired killers working for money. We're a family fighting for survival." Silas carefully returned the medal and photograph to their box, then placed the box back in its hiding place beneath the floorboard. When he straightened up, Clara saw that he had shed the last vestiges of the simple mountain man persona. Standing before them now was Sergeant Silas McGraw, veteran of Gettysburg, Congressional Medal of Honor recipient, and a man who had never lost a battle when the stakes truly mattered. "Then let's get to work," he said simply. "We have a war to win." The waterproof leather pouch had been sewn into the lining of Clara's mother's traveling coat, hidden so carefully that it had taken Clara 5 years to discover it. She found it while searching through the last of her parents' belongings, looking for anything that might give them an advantage in the coming fight. What she discovered inside the pouch would change everything she thought she knew about her family's story. The legal documents were pristine, protected from moisture and time by the careful preparation of someone who understood their enormous value. As Clara spread them across the cabin table, Silas and Jake gathering close behind her, she felt the weight of revelations that would reshape not just her understanding of the past, but her vision of the future. "This isn't just a will," Clara said, her voice tight with growing excitement and anger. "Look at this. It's a complete record of the conspiracy against my father." The first document was indeed Edmund Evans's will, leaving his entire estate to his daughter Clara upon her majority. But beneath it lay something far more damaging to the men who had destroyed her family, a detailed accounting of every fraudulent transaction, every forged document, every illegal transfer of property that had been used to steal the Evans fortune. "Your father knew," Silas said grimly, reading over Clara's shoulder. "He knew what they were doing to him, and he documented every bit of it." Jake picked up a letter written in Edmund Evans's careful handwriting, dated just weeks before his death. Listen to this. If you are reading this, my dear Clara, then Charlotte and I have not survived to see justice done, but we have not died in vain if these documents find their way into your hands. Marcus Holbrook, Jonathan Reed, and Samuel Whitfield believe they have committed the perfect crime, but their greed has made them careless. Every theft they have perpetrated is recorded here, along with proof of their methods and accomplices. Clara felt tears sting her eyes as she heard her father's words read aloud. For 5 years she had mourned him as a failure, a man who had lost everything through bad luck and poor judgment. Now she was learning that Edmund Evans had been a fighter, who had refused to surrender even when death was closing in around him. "There's more," Clara said, unfolding another document. "This is a deed to a silver mine in Colorado Territory, dated 3 months before the auction where Silas bought me. My father transferred ownership to me personally, separate from the main estate." Silas studied the deed carefully, noting the precise legal language and official seals. "Clara, do you understand what this means? Even if Holbrook and his partners had succeeded in stealing the shipping company and all the other assets, this mine would still belong to you. Your father made sure they couldn't touch it, but it was the final document that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. It was a confession, signed and witnessed, from a man named Thomas Bradley, who identified himself as a former employee of Holbrook, Reed and Whitfield. "I hereby confess that I participated in the murder of Edmund and Charlotte Evans at the direction of my employers." Clara read aloud, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We made their deaths appear natural by introducing small amounts of arsenic into their food over a period of several months. When they became too sick to resist, we destroyed their remaining assets and arranged for their daughter to be sold at auction to prevent her from ever learning the truth about her inheritance." The cabin fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Clara set down the confession with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a rage so pure it seemed to burn in her veins like liquid fire. "They didn't just steal from my family," she said quietly. "They murdered my parents, slowly, deliberately, making them suffer while they watched everything they had worked for being stolen piece by piece." Jake reached out to place a comforting hand on her shoulder, but Clara shrugged him off gently. She needed to feel the full weight of this revelation, needed to let it fuel the determination that would carry her through what was to come. "Where did your mother get all this?" Silas asked, his tactical mind already working through the implications of what they had discovered. Clara examined the pouch more carefully, noting a small compartment she had initially missed. Inside was a key and a piece of paper with an address in Denver written in her mother's handwriting. A safety deposit box, Clara realized. Mama must have hidden copies of everything in a bank vault. That's why the confession is here. Thomas Bradley must have contacted my parents before he died, trying to clear his conscience. Silas stood up and began pacing the length of the cabin, his military training evident in the precise way he moved while thinking through complex problems. "This changes our entire situation," he said finally. "These documents don't just prove your right to the Evans inheritance, they prove that Holbrook, Reed, and Whitfield are murderers. With this evidence, we could have them arrested and tried for capital crimes. If we can get to the authorities alive," Jake pointed out grimly, "and if we can find honest officials who haven't been bought off." Clara carefully refolded the documents and returned them to their protective pouch. "We're not going to the authorities," she said with quiet certainty. "Not yet, anyway." Both men looked at her in surprise. Jake was the first to speak. "Clara, with evidence like this, we could end this without violence. We could let the law handle Holbrook and his partners." Clara met his eyes steadily, and Jake saw something in her expression that reminded him powerfully of Silas when the mountain man was preparing for battle. "The law failed my parents when they needed it most," Clara said. "These men bought judges, bribed officials, and corrupted an entire system to steal what belonged to my family. I'm not going to trust that same system to deliver justice now." "Then what are you proposing?" Silas asked, though Clara suspected he already knew what she was thinking. "I'm proposing that we deal with the immediate threat first, the men who are coming to kill us. And then, when we've proven that Clara Evans is not the helpless victim they think she is, we use these documents to destroy them completely." Clara stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the mountain valley that had been her sanctuary and school for 5 years. When she turned back to face Silas and Jake, they saw not the grateful rescued child who had arrived in these mountains, but a young woman who had been forged into something formidable by love, training, and now righteous anger. "My parents spent their last months knowing they were being murdered and robbed, powerless to stop it or protect their daughter. They died believing they had failed me," Clara continued, her voice carrying the weight of absolute resolve. "But they didn't fail. They left me everything I need to destroy the men who killed them and reclaim what was stolen. They gave me truth, evidence, and," she gestured to Silas, "they gave me a father who taught me to fight." Silas smiled grimly at her words, recognizing the steel that had been developing in his adopted daughter over the past 5 years. Clara Evans had grown into exactly the kind of woman who could face down killers and emerge victorious. "The men coming for us think they're hunting down loose ends," Clara said. "They think they're finishing a job they started 5 years ago. But they're wrong. They're not hunting me, I'm hunting them. And when this is over, Marcus Holbrook, Jonathan Reed, and Samuel Whitfield are going to learn that some debts can only be paid in blood." Outside the cabin, storm clouds were gathering over the mountain peaks, promising snow before morning. But inside, around the table where Clara's father's evidence lay spread like battle plans, 3 people prepared to fight, not just for their lives, but for justice that had been 5 years in the making. The frightened child who had stood on that auction block was gone forever. In her place stood Clara Evans, rightful heir to a fortune and daughter of a warrior, ready to claim both her inheritance and her revenge. The hand-drawn map spread across the cabin table looked like a military campaign plan, which in many ways it was. Silas had sketched every detail of their mountain valley with the precision of a veteran soldier who understood that survival often depended on knowing exactly where each rock and tree stood in relation to one's position. "They'll come up the main trail here," Silas said, pointing to the eastern approach with the tip of his knife. "It's the only route that makes sense for men on horseback who don't know the country, but that gives us several advantages." Clara leaned over the map, her finger tracing the narrow path that wound up from the lower elevations. "There are at least 3 places where the trail passes between rocks that could hide a shooter. And here," she indicated a spot where the path curved sharply around a boulder formation. "They'll have to come around blind, not knowing what's waiting on the other side." Jake nodded approvingly at her tactical thinking. Over the past week, Clara had proven herself to be a natural strategist, able to see patterns and possibilities that escaped less trained minds. "What about their horses? If we can stampede them early, it forces the riders to continue on foot." "Exactly what I was thinking," Silas agreed. "Men afoot in unfamiliar territory are at a severe disadvantage. They'll be slower, noisier, and easier to track." The plan they had developed was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its thoroughness. Rather than wait passively in the cabin for an attack, they would use the entire valley as their battlefield, turning familiar terrain into a maze of carefully prepared traps and ambush points. Clara rose from the table and walked to the window, noting how the afternoon sun cast shadows that would provide concealment for someone who knew where to position themselves. In a few hours, those shadows would deepen into the kind of mountain twilight that could hide an army of defenders from unwary attackers. "There's something we need to discuss," she said without turning around. "What happens if one of us doesn't survive this fight?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace, acknowledged but difficult to address directly. Jake was the first to respond. "If something happens to me, you and Silas stick to the plan. Don't try to rescue me or change tactics to help me if I'm wounded. The mission is keeping you alive, Clara, not saving me." Silas nodded grimly at the young man's words. "Jake's right. Clara, you're the one they're really after. If Jake or you fall, you keep fighting until you can get away safely." But Clara turned from the window, with determination written clearly across her features. "No, we're a family, and families don't abandon each other. We win this fight together, or we don't win it at all." "Clara," Silas began, but she cut him off with a gesture. "Listen to me, both of you. 5 years ago, I was a helpless child who needed rescuing, but that's not who I am anymore. I'm Clara Evans, daughter of Edmund and Charlotte Evans, trained by one of the finest soldiers who ever wore a uniform, and I'm not going to hide behind either of you while you risk your lives for mine." She moved to the gun rack where her Winchester hung clean and ready, running her fingers along the stock that had been worn smooth by years of practice and training. "We fight as equals," Clara continued. "We watch each other's backs, we trust each other's skills, and we make sure every one of those bastards who murdered my parents pays the full price for what they've done." Jake looked at Silas, seeing his own thoughts reflected in the older man's eyes. Clara had grown into someone who could not be protected through exclusion from danger. She could only be protected by being trusted as a full partner in facing it. "All right," Silas said finally. "We fight together, but that means we need to talk about what comes after, assuming we all survive." Clara returned to the table and sat down, giving both men her full attention. "Go on, with the evidence. Your parents left behind, you can destroy Holbrook, Reed, and Whitfield completely. But claiming your inheritance and seeing justice done will require you to leave these mountains, at least temporarily. You'll need lawyers, you'll need to deal with banks and courts, and you'll need to establish yourself as the rightful heir to the Evans fortune." Clara had been thinking about this same issue for days, torn between her love for the mountain life that had shaped her and her responsibility to honor her parents' memory by reclaiming what had been stolen from them. "I've been considering that," she said, "and I think I know what I want to do." She looked at Jake, seeing love and support in his blue eyes, then at Silas, seeing paternal pride mixed with concern for her happiness. "I want to claim the inheritance, not because I care about being wealthy, but because it will give me the resources to help other children who find themselves in situations like mine. I want to build something good from the money that was stolen from my family." Jake reached across the table to take her hand. "What kind of something? A place where orphaned children can be safe, educated, and loved. Maybe here in the territory, maybe somewhere else. I haven't decided yet, but I want to make sure that no other child has to stand on an auction block wondering if the person who buys them will be kind or cruel." Silas smiled at her words, recognizing the compassionate heart that had always lived beneath Clara's growing strength and determination. "Your parents would be proud of that plan, Clara. It turns their suffering into something that helps others." "But first," Clara said, her expression hardening again, "we deal with the men who are coming to kill us, and we make sure they understand that Clara Evans is not a victim. She's a force of justice that they created with their own greed and cruelty." The sun was setting behind the western peaks now, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Clara of the autumn day 5 years ago when Silas had first brought her to this valley. So much had changed since then, but the mountains remained constant, solid and enduring, like the bond between the three people preparing to fight for their lives. "Time to take positions," Silas said, consulting his pocket watch. If Jake's information was accurate, they should reach the lower valley within the hour. Clara stood up and slung her rifle over her shoulder, checking that her ammunition pouch was secure and her knife was properly seated in its sheath. She felt strangely calm, as if all the fear and uncertainty of the past week had crystallized into clear, focused determination. "Clara," Jake said, as they prepared to leave the cabin for what might be the last time, "I want you to know that whatever happens tonight, These have been the best days of my life. Getting to know you, being accepted by Silas as part of your family, it's more than I ever hoped for." Clara stood on her toes and kissed him gently, a promise of the future they would build together if they survived the night ahead. "Then let's make sure we have many more days just like them," she said softly. Silas cleared his throat, drawing their attention to the practical matters at hand. "Remember, we stick to the plan no matter what happens. We use our advantages, knowledge of the terrain, superior shooting positions, and the element of surprise. We don't take unnecessary risks, and we don't give them any chance to regroup or coordinate their attack." Clara and Jake nodded their understanding. They had spent days going over every detail, every contingency, every possible scenario. Now, it was time to put their training and planning to the ultimate test. As they left the warmth and safety of the cabin behind, stepping out into the crisp mountain evening, Clara felt the weight of her parents' locket against her chest, and the solid comfort of the Winchester in her hands. Somewhere below them in the gathering darkness, professional killers were riding toward what they believed would be an easy completion of a 5-year-old contract. They were about to discover that Clara Evans had spent those 5 years becoming something far more dangerous than they could imagine. The auction block had created a victim, but the mountains had forged a warrior. Tonight, the men who had destroyed her family would learn the difference. Clara's father's pocket watch ticked steadily in her palm as she crouched behind the boulder formation that guarded the eastern approach to their valley. The familiar weight of the timepiece, warm from her body heat, provided an anchor of calm in the moments before violence would shatter the mountain stillness. 8:47 in the evening, and the last light of day was fading from the peaks above. Below her position, the main trail wound through shadows that would hide her muzzle flash, while exposing anyone foolish enough to ride up the path without proper reconnaissance. The sound came first, iron horseshoes striking stone, the creak of leather, and the low murmur of men's voices carried on the evening air. Clara felt her pulse steady rather than quicken, all of Silas's training crystallizing into the kind of focused alertness that separates survivors from victims. She counted them by sound as they approached. 6 horses, which meant 6 men if Jake's intelligence had been accurate. Professional killers, experienced and well-armed, but utterly unprepared for the kind of reception that awaited them in this remote mountain valley. The first rider came into view around the bend in the trail, and Clara felt a cold satisfaction as she recognized the type, well-dressed, well-armed, and completely out of place in the wilderness. His companions followed in single file, their formation perfect for navigating a narrow trail, but disastrous for responding to an ambush. Clara checked the watch one more time. 8:51. According to their plan, Silas would be in position on the north ridge with a clear field of fire down the length of the trail. Jake would be hidden among the rocks on the south side, ready to block any retreat back down the mountain. Everything depended on timing and precision, qualities that had been drilled into Clara through 5 years of patient instruction. The lead rider raised his hand, signaling a halt just 50 yards from Clara's concealed position. She could hear his voice clearly now, discussing something with the man beside him about the layout of the valley ahead. "The cabin should be just around that next bend," the leader was saying. "Remember, we take the girl alive if possible, but don't hesitate to shoot if she resists. The old man is expendable. Kill him on sight." Clara's grip tightened on her rifle. At those words, they spoke of murdering Silas as casually as they might discuss the weather, confirming everything she had suspected about the kind of men her family's killers employed. But it was the next exchange that made Clara's blood run cold with rage. "What about after we finish here?" one of the other riders asked. "Holbrook said something about a bonus if we can make it look like an accident." "Landslide," the leader replied with casual cruelty. "We shoot them, then bring down enough rock to bury the cabin and everything in it. By the time anyone finds this place, if they ever do, it'll just look like the mountain decided to reclaim the valley. Clara closed the watch with a soft click, the sound barely audible, but significant in ways the killers below could never understand. Her father had carried this timepiece through the building of his shipping empire, through his courtship of her mother, and through the slow poisoning that had ended his life. Now it would time the moment when justice finally found the men who had destroyed the Evans family. She raised her rifle to her shoulder, settling into the shooting position that had become as natural as breathing after thousands of hours of practice. The leader of the killers sat his horse perfectly framed in her sights, close enough that she could see the arrogant confidence in his posture. But Clara didn't fire. Not yet. According to their plan, she would wait for Silas to take the first shot, eliminating the rear rider and preventing any escape down the trail. Then Jake would open fire from his position, and Clara would complete the trap by taking out the leader and anyone who tried to charge up the trail toward the cabin. The pocket watch had stopped ticking, but Clara could feel time itself holding its breath as the moment of truth approached. Below her, 6 professional killers prepared to murder what they thought would be helpless victims. Above them, hidden in positions that offered perfect fields of fire, 3 people who had become a family, prepared to prove that some predators had chosen the wrong prey. The crack of Silas's rifle shattered the mountain silence, and Clara saw the rearmost rider pitch forward in his saddle before toppling to the ground. The surviving killers' horses reared and plunged in panic, exactly as Silas had predicted they would. Jake's rifle spoke next, the bullet taking another rider in the chest as he fought to control his frightened mount. 4 killers remained, but their neat formation had dissolved into chaos as horses scattered and men shouted conflicting orders. Clara exhaled slowly and squeezed her trigger, watching through her sight as the leader of the killers jerked backward and fell from his horse. 3 left, and their tactical situation had gone from advantageous to desperate in the space of 10 seconds. The trap had been sprung perfectly, but the battle was far from over. The surviving killers had taken cover behind a fallen log, their professional training evident in how quickly they had adapted to the ambush. But Clara knew they were trapped. Silas controlled the high ground behind them. Jake blocked their retreat, and she commanded the approach to the cabin they had come to destroy. "You're surrounded," Clara called out, her voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Throw down your weapons, and we'll let you leave alive." The response came in the form of rifle fire that sparked off the rocks near her position. These men had no intention of surrendering, which suited Clara perfectly. She had not expected mercy from the kind of people who murdered families for money, and she was prepared to offer none in return. One of the killers broke from cover, trying to reach a better position among the rocks to Clara's left. His movement exposed him to Jake's position, and the young trapper's rifle cracked once. The killer stumbled and fell, clutching his shoulder, but still alive. "That's 4 down, 2 to go," Clara murmured to herself, working the action of her Winchester to chamber a fresh round. The mathematics of the battle were working in their favor, but she knew that cornered men could be the most dangerous of all. A voice called out from behind the fallen log, harsh with desperation and rage. "Clara Evans, we know you're up there. Come down and we'll make this quick. Keep hiding like a coward and we'll make sure you die slow." Clara felt a cold smile cross her lips. These men still thought they were hunting a helpless victim, even with 3 of their number dead or wounded and their position hopeless. Their arrogance would be the last mistake they ever made. Instead of answering with words, Clara began moving carefully from rock to rock, using every bit of fieldcraft Silas had taught her to circle around toward the killer's position. If they wanted to flush her out of hiding, she would give them exactly what they asked for, but not in the way they expected. She could hear them talking in low, urgent voices as they tried to coordinate their response to the trap that had destroyed their mission. One of them wanted to retreat down the trail, despite Jake's covering fire. The other insisted they had to complete the job or face their employer's wrath. Clara reached a position where she could see both surviving killers clearly. One was a thin, pale man who looked familiar. She realized with a shock that it was the same predator who had been bidding on her at the auction 5 years ago. The other was younger, harder looking, with the bearing of an ex-soldier who had turned his skills to evil purposes. The pale man was reloading his rifle when Clara stepped out from behind her cover, her Winchester trained on his center mass. "Remember me?" she asked conversationally. "From the auction block in Missouri." The man's eyes widened as he recognized her, and Clara saw something she had never expected. Fear. The helpless child he remembered had been replaced by a young woman who moved like a predator and held her rifle with the casual confidence of someone who had never missed an important shot. "You were going to buy me that day," Clara continued, her voice steady and calm. "What were you planning to do with an 11-year-old girl?" The pale man's hands shook as he tried to finish reloading, but Clara's presence seemed to have stripped away his composure entirely. We were just following orders. Holbrook said, "Marcus Holbrook ordered you to murder my parents," Clara interrupted. "Just like he's ordered you to murder me. But there's something he didn't tell you about the Evans family." She took a step closer, and the pale man actually whimpered with fear. "We don't die easy, and we don't forget." The ex-soldier beside him made a desperate grab for his pistol, but Clara's rifle spoke before he could clear leather. The bullet took him in the chest and he fell backward, his weapon skittering across the rocky ground. The pale man dropped his rifle entirely, raising his hands in surrender. "Please, I'll tell you everything. Holbrook's plans, where he is, how much money. I already know everything," Clara said quietly, reaching into her shirt to pull out a folded paper. "Including your confession, Thomas Bradley." The man's face went white as he recognized the document his dying conscience had compelled him to write years earlier. "How? Where did you—" "My parents were smarter than you gave them credit for," Clara replied. "They documented every crime, saved every piece of evidence, and made sure that someday someone would come for the men who destroyed them. She could—" Hear Silas and Jake moving down from their positions, coming to check on the wounded and make sure the threat was truly ended. But Clara kept her rifle trained on the last surviving killer, the man whose guilty conscience had provided the key evidence that would destroy her family's murderers. "You're going to write another confession," Clara told him. "Everything you know about Holbrook, Reed, and Whitfield. Every crime they've committed, every murder they've ordered, every dollar they've stolen. And then you're going to help me make sure they face justice for what they've done." The pale man nodded frantically, grateful to be alive and willing to say anything that might keep him that way. Clara lowered her rifle, but did not relax her vigilance. The battle was over, but the war for justice was just beginning. 6 months later, Clara stood on the porch of the mountain cabin that had been her sanctuary and school, watching the morning sun paint the peaks in shades of gold and rose. The simple gold band on her left hand caught the light, still new enough to feel strange, but precious beyond any treasure her parents' fortune could buy. The wedding had taken place in the valley meadow, where Clara had first learned to track deer and read weather signs, with Silas performing the ceremony and the mountains themselves serving as witnesses. Jake had carved their wedding rings from gold taken from Clara's own mine, the one her father had secretly transferred to her name before his death. It seemed fitting that the metal that bound them together had come from Colorado earth, just as their love had grown from the soil of these wild places. "Mrs. Morrison," Jake called from inside the cabin, his voice carrying the warmth that never failed to make Clara's heart skip. "Your husband requires assistance with these legal documents, if you please." Clara laughed, the sound echoing off the valley walls like music. 6 months of marriage had not diminished the joy she felt at hearing herself called by Jake's name, though she had legally retained Evans as well for the business matters that now occupied much of her time. Inside the cabin, the main table was covered with correspondence from lawyers, bank officials, and government investigators. The confession Thomas Bradley had written in exchange for his life had opened floodgates of legal action that were still, washing away the empire Marcus Holbrook and his partners had built on stolen wealth. The final accounting came in from Boston, Jake said, holding up a thick envelope. Your father's shipping company has been fully restored to your ownership, along with all assets that were fraudulently transferred. The lawyers estimate your total inheritance at just over $3 million. Clara picked up the letter and scanned its contents with the same careful attention Silas had taught her to apply to tracking dangerous animals. Wealth, on such a scale, still seemed almost impossible to comprehend, but she had already decided what she would do with it. And the criminal proceedings? She asked. Holbrook and Reed were sentenced to hang yesterday, Jake replied with grim satisfaction. Whitfield died in prison before his trial could be completed, but the judge said it was probably a mercy. The other prisoners didn't take kindly to men who murdered families for profit. Clara nodded, feeling not joy at the news, but a deep sense of completion. Justice had been served, her parents' murders had been avenged, and the men who had destroyed so many lives would never hurt anyone else. It was enough. Silas entered from outside, carrying an armload of firewood and wearing the contented expression of a man whose most important battles had been won. At 57, he showed no signs of slowing down, but Clara had noticed him spending more time in contemplative activities like whittling and less time on the demanding physical work of mountain life. Letter came in yesterday's mail pouch, he said, pulling an envelope from his shirt pocket. From that architect fellow in Denver. He says the plans for your school are nearly complete. Clara took the letter eagerly, unfolding the detailed drawings that showed how her vision was taking shape. The Clara Evans Home for Children would be built in a valley 20 miles south of their own, close enough to visit regularly, but far enough to give the children their own space to grow and learn. The facility would house 50 orphaned children, providing them not just shelter and food, but education, training in practical skills, and most importantly, the kind of love and guidance that Silas had given Clara. She intended to hire teachers, craftsmen, and farmers who understood that broken children needed patient care to become whole adults. When do they expect to break ground? Jake asked, looking over her shoulder at the drawings. Early spring, Clara replied. The first children should be able to move in by next autumn. She paused, then added with quiet determination, I want to make sure no child ever has to stand on an auction block again, wondering if the person who buys them will be kind or cruel. Silas smiled at her words, recognizing the compassionate heart that had always lived beneath Clara's growing strength. Your parents would be proud, Clara. You've taken the worst thing that ever happened to you and used it to build something that will help others for generations to come. Clara moved to the window and gazed out at the mountains that had shaped her into the woman she had become. In the distance, she could see the trail where professional killers had once ridden to destroy her family. Now just another path through the wilderness where deer grazed peacefully in the morning sun. I've been thinking, she said thoughtfully, about what I want to tell the children when they arrive at the school, about how to survive when the world seems determined to break you. And what will you tell them? Jake asked gently. Clara turned back to face the two men who had become her world, seeing in their weathered faces the love that had transformed her from victim to victor. I'll tell them that sometimes the cruelest moments in life lead to the greatest blessings, that there are people in this world who will protect you when you can't protect yourself, teach you when you don't know how to learn, and love you when you don't believe you deserve it. She smiled, thinking of all the children who would soon benefit from the same gift Silas had given her. I'll tell them that strength isn't something you're born with. It's something you build day by day, choice by choice, until you become someone who can't be broken by anything the world throws at you. Outside the cabin, snow was beginning to fall, the first promise of another mountain winter. But inside, surrounded by the warmth of family and the satisfaction of justice served, Clara felt only gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened child who had stood on that auction block 11 years ago was gone forever, replaced by a woman who had learned to fight for what she loved and build something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. And in the spring, when the mountain meadows bloomed with wildflowers, that woman would open her arms to 50 children who needed exactly what Silas McGraw had given her: hope, protection, and the chance to discover that they were worth fighting. For the mountains endured, the family prospered, and justice finally had found its way home.